people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it.
Yeah.
But I think where it really matters for at the company level is you're not necessarily telling them, here's why I believe in this. It's here's why you should care about it.
Yeah.
And then it's
To them.
here's what we do about it. And I think that when you to the point of the features, the featureism, let's say, it's really, really easy to get caught up in all the great things that your product, your service, your offering can provide. But if it's not tied back to a core issue, problem, pain point, it doesn't really matter.
And we're back for another episode of the Startup Hustle. This is your host, Matt Watson. Excited to be joined today by Rajiv Nathan, who is our startup hype man today. He's going to tell us how to pitch your company, be it talking to investors, talking to customers. How do you get that pitch down? And I don't know about you guys, but nothing is more frustrating when I talk to a founder and I'm like, what is it you guys do? And like, they can't even answer the question. And I've literally had that conversation with people a few times. I'm like, dude, you suck at this. Like, you need to get this together. He needs Rajiv and his company, I think, to help. So we're going to get some best practices today. Before we get started, I do want to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by Fullscale, which is my company. If you're looking to hire software developers, we have over 300 developers in the Philippines helping other startups and even publicly traded companies affordably scale their development teams. You can hire amazing developers for $5,000 to $6,000 a month, senior level, out of the Philippines. Check us out at fullscale.io. Raj Nation is here. Tell us
What's
about
up?
how to get the money from the customer. I want the money from the customers, not the money from the investors, by the way. And hopefully we'll talk about that today too. But how did you get into this? How did you become the pitch man, the hype man?
So I never thought I'd be doing this. And I feel like that's like a story you hear all the time.
I never thought I would be doing this either. So it's okay.
I had a marketing background. And I was only a few years into my professional career when I quit my job accidentally. Yes, I accidentally quit my job. I was working at an agency for a few years, and my second half of my last year there, I didn't love it anymore. I had moved into a sales role, and I wasn't succeeding in the sales role either. And I just kind of hit a point. I was doing some things on the side that were more interesting, and I hit a point where I didn't want to be there anymore. And I got put on a PIP, actually, which for those who don't know is performance improvement plan.
It's like a death sentence.
Yeah, exactly. You basically, depending on the terms of your specific PIP, you have anywhere from like 30 to 60 days to hit certain KPIs, and if you don't, you get fired. And in my case, I was in a sales role and I wasn't hitting my numbers. So it's very clear what like the metric of success was. So I got put on a PIP, and I was so angry when I got put on the PIP because a few months prior, I had actually like told the company, I was like, look, like I didn't get any training coming in, like when I transitioned into this role, and I don't really know what I'm doing. And I could use some support and help and training. And I was just kind of told like, we don't have the bandwidth to support that right now. Just like, focus heads down on selling, to which I'm like, yeah, but I'm telling you, I don't know what direction my head should be when you say down because I don't have the training.
Yeah.
So through that, I got so mad that they would do that to me after, because I was like, I called this was going to happen. And that actually like really fueled me, that anger. And so I beat the PIP. And I think it was 45 or 60 days, whatever it was. I think maybe 45. So I get to the other side of the PIP, but I'm telling you, that 45 days was so exhausting. Like I was coming into the office, I want to say I was getting in there by 7:30 and not leaving until 8 p.m. every day. And I was, and the whole time I almost felt like there was just like an elephant stepping on my chest. Like I couldn't really like breathe properly. Because you feel like you're under a microscope the whole time.
Yeah.
And when I got to the other side of it and I had quote unquote won, I finally could take a full exhale. And that was when I was like, wait, but the only reason I did all that work was to just prove that I could, not because I actually want to.
Yeah.
So, another like month or so went by, and then we hit December 3rd, which is my birthday. and I was having my weekly one-on-one with my boss. And through that, we were just doing, and she was traveling, so it was, it was on the phone, and we weren't, this was 2014, so we weren't even doing a video call, it was just a phone call. And we're doing the weekly checkup, which is like a pipeline review when you're in sales. So it's like, okay, like what's the status of this deal? Like how many new opportunities have you created? How many leads have you contacted, et cetera? And my answer just kept being like, not really, none, not much. And then so in this stretch of like answering these questions, I accidentally blurted out like, and I don't think I want to be here anymore. And then there was like 5 seconds of silence, I think. And she was like, wait, you mean like you don't want to be here, or you just like want a different role at the company? And I was like, no, I just think I'm done, like overall. And so anyways, we ended up talking about it. She was actually really gracious about it. And I ended up resigning a couple weeks later. Fast forward, I had started something on the side, which was more around personal brand development, made that my full-time thing, made a couple-year run at that, and that didn't work out. We just didn't have a business model that worked for it. But in sunsetting that, I happened to get a call from the head of an incubator here in Chicago where I am, who had heard about what I was doing, and he was like, hey, I know you're good at that like pitch and brand stuff for individuals in the career market. Do you think you could do it for businesses as well? Because we've got a new cohort coming in. They have to have a demo day. The last one didn't do so well. Do you think you could support them? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. I got you. And we structured like a small outside consulting contract for it. And when I got off the phone, I frantically Google searched what is a startup pitch. I didn't, aside from watching Shark Tank, I didn't have exposure to the world. So I was a quick study though, and I could, with my storytelling background from other things, I was able to like put the pieces together pretty quickly. I kind of needed to just know like, what is the arena I'm playing in and what are the boundary lines on the field? And then like, how do you take, storytelling and fit it within that? And then, that first cohort did really well, like with the support I was giving them. There was people who raised money coming out of it. There were people who had like massive revenue growth. So I was like, I think I want this to be the next thing. And then over time, what I realized was like, once I kind of like, let's say, I don't want to say mastered, but something to that effect, mastered the boundary lines of the arena of the field, then I figured out like, okay, well now how do you actually like nudge the boundaries a little bit wider or put a dent in them? How do you break them open a little bit to have more successful pitches to like really convince an audience, that kind of stuff?
Well, and so we say pitch, like potentially you have the customer pitch, you have pitching to investors. I think a lot of times people think about the investor side of this. So I'm curious, how would you describe the landscape of all the different things that founders need help with? Like, what are all the different things when you think of pitch?
I think it's a wasted effort if you just think of your pitch through the silo of raising capital and communicating with investors, because investors are ultimately not the people who are going to buy your product. Yeah, they're going to put money into your company so that you can then sell, so that you can then get customers. But the reality is the best way to talk to an investor is to show them how you talk to your customers. So come up with your customer language and put that in front of an investor. And I think this is where a lot of startups and founders really, really struggle, is they get so caught up in investor speak. And then they're like trying to figure out, do we say disruptive AI or AI disruption, right? And then they're trapped in these buzzwords that they think are impressive, but everyone else says those words, so it doesn't differentiate. And on top of that, it doesn't actually make sense. At the beginning of this, you were like, you talk to a lot of founders and they can't tell you what they do. One of like the tells is if someone opens with, well, what I would usually say is, and if you have to preface with the phrase, what I would usually say is, that means that that's what you do. Like, you're not usually saying what comes after that. You're usually having to preface your pitch. So you're actually, it's a tell that you don't have much confidence in what you're about to say because you're trying to temper it and hedge against them not having an ideal reaction. But they should and they could, would, and should have an ideal reaction if you dial in your overall messaging more to who your true target audience is, because that's where you get the clear and direct and compelling and concise language. And then if you're going to raise money, you start to show investors that kind of language. And then that convinces them this person knows how to talk to their audience.
I want to give an example of this, an example of, I think, the problem that most entrepreneurs have. So my last company, a SaaS company, was called At Capacity. And if you said, oh, what do? I could say, well, we dynamically control Google ads. We change the budget. We turn the ads on and off. And we built software that controls the ads. And we sell that to plumbers and HVAC people, right? Like that could be one description. Or you could say, we help plumbers save money on their advertising and get more leads when they need more leads. Which one sounds better?
I would take the latter, and I would actually take it a step further. So you can get to an even like juicier point with people, an even more compelling point if you expand on what you just said. And you can use the one-liner great, and then you can expand on it afterwards. Or what I would even recommend is you say something like, if you're a contractor like a plumber or an HVAC business owner, your entire business is predicated on people in your zip code, your neighborhood, your zip code, your local geography, knowing you exist in the first place. The only way they know that is through looking on Google. And if your listing doesn't come up at the top in the first three, chances are they're never going to find out who you are. And then the service that you actually advertise doesn't get to be delivered at the end of the day. Google shouldn't be in charge of your destiny. And then you bring in your company from there. So what you've done is you've anchored everything.
Set the problem.
Around, exactly. You've anchored everything around a really clear and specific problem. And it's not just like you highlight the problem. It's that like, and I was totally off the top of my head, so I don't know. Actually, don't even know what I said. But notice the way that I talked was very specific, and you can like picture in your head what's happening. It wasn't generalizing anyone's issue. It was painting a clear, specific instance of an issue.
I think the key thing is if you're pitching other business owners, especially, they care about the problems, right? I have a specific problem I need to solve, and you really got to pitch to the problem where, you know, and the problem and the solution, like this is how we solve that problem, and we're better than anybody else at solving that problem. But I think the problem that many founders make is they're just so focused on like the features of like, well, this is what we do this thing. But they're never really focused on the like why and the real problem it solves, the real solution. Is that the challenge you have with most people you deal with? Like they're kind of in that mode and you're like, no, you got to get to another level of like, no, this is why people buy this. We don't care what you do, we care why they buy it.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the Simon Sinek framework, right? People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. Yeah. But I think where it really matters for at the company level is you're not necessarily telling them here's why I believe in this. It's here's why you should care about it.
Yeah.
And then it's here's what we do about it. And I think that when you to the point of the features, the featureism, let's say, it's really, really easy to get caught up in all the great things that your product, your service, your offering can provide. But if it's not tied back to a core issue, problem, pain point, it doesn't really matter. And the other thing too is a lot of founders want to give everything about what they do upfront. And if you do that, what ends up happening is you just find yourself in a situation where you are information overwhelming people, and it's like death by information overwhelm with that, and they don't know where to take things next. There's a good reference point is if you go back to the original Steve Jobs iPhone keynote. The original iPhone, which is largely similar to today, obviously they've added more things, but like the original iPhone you know, all the apps that came loaded on it, it was like, you know, it was text messaging, it was phone, it was internet, you know, Safari, calculator, stocks, weather, notes, right? There were probably like 20, 25 preloaded apps. All Steve Jobs focused on in the first, I don't know, 10 minutes of that talk was the top three. We have a brand new phone, a revolutionary internet browser, and an all new iPod. It just happens to be in one device.
Yeah.
And that's when everyone lost their mind, right? So he did, you know, he could have said, oh, and by the way, it has notes and stocks and weather and stuff like that. But like people can find that stuff out later on their own. He doesn't have to spend the first 10 minutes of his talk. And I think later on when he's in like a deep demo, he does go into the stocks app. But it's, you know, the average founder wants to tell you all 20 of those apps in the first minute.
Yeah.
And then it's, you know, it's a pick your own adventure.
So I want to talk more about mistakes that people make doing this. And I think we've talked on one of them, right? They tell you too much information. They're focused on the features. They're not focused on the problem. They're not focused on how it's relevant to the end consumer of this. What are some other mistakes that people make when they're trying to build out a pitch?
So let's start with like just the base formula that I think everyone needs to know and kind of build from there. Because I think if you're not doing this, then you know you are making a mistake, in fact. So every founder just wants to think about their pitch deck. What does my pitch deck say? What does my pitch deck say? What does my pitch deck say? But you are never going to get to that pitch deck if you do not have a good elevator pitch first. And I'm a firm believer that your first 60 seconds determines your next 60 minutes. So you're either going to turn people on or turn people off in that first 60 seconds. And they're going to either buy in and want to learn more, or they're going to buy out and want to leave. So this is where having an elevator pitch really, really matters. And in 60 seconds or less, you can use this formula. So years ago, I came up with this. It's called the K-PASA elevator pitch formula. If you know Spanish, then you would know that K-PASA in Spanish means what's up or what's happening. And that's what you have to do is tell people what's up. What's up with them, therefore what's up with you. The acronym of K-PASA is PASA. Problem, approach, solution, action. Problem, approach, solution, action. When you talk and communicate in that structure of language, you are taking people on a journey. It's actually a 1-minute story that you're telling or less. And if you're hearing this and you're like, oh, 1 minute sounds like a long time. I've heard people say, 5 seconds or less, 10 seconds or less. My answer to that is, yeah, if it's bad. If what you're saying is uninteresting, you don't have more than 5 or 10 seconds with someone. But if what you're saying is interesting, they'll hang on to your every word. And the reason why this formula is so effective is because by leading with the problem in a clear and compelling and direct and like human speak way, not bringing in disruption and all that kind of stuff. What you're doing is starting at an emotional level, right? You're tapping into emotion first and using that as sort of the entry point to introduce your product, which is rational, it's reason, it's tangible, etc. So if you start with emotion, you get people interested initially, and then they'll be more interested in hearing what you have to say about your product. The other aspect, too, is the better you can articulate the problem, the less you have to say about your solution. Because, let me think through how to say this, because when you have a well-articulated problem, your listener is already starting to formulate in their head where this is going and what the product likely is. So then, when you actually say what your offering is, your product, since they've already started to make some assumptions, you don't need to dote on it forever. And on top of that, by the time you say your solution, because they were already thinking about it as you were highlighting the problem really well, your solution now becomes a reinforcing thought. It's a reinforcing statement to a thought they already had.
Like, wow, you can solve all these problems.
Exactly, right? So now it's like you're giving them confirmation bias of a belief they started to have versus trying to convince them of something that they've never heard of before. And it's kind of like a Jedi mind trick in that respect. by leading with the problem. Now, when I say this, lead with the problem and be direct and compelling and all that stuff, here's where a few mistakes do come in. Leading with the problem is not to say machine learning is a $400 billion industry growing 10% annually.
Yeah, nobody cares about that.
Right? Like, and this is
Nobody
where
cares.
so many founders make, I call it the market size mistake. They make this mistake. They think that someone's going to drop their jaw if they talk about market size. And, you know, I don't want to be the bad guy, but I'm just saying, don't swing big TAM energy and think people are going to be impressed. It's not that your market size doesn't matter. It's just like, that is by no means unique to you, because anyone in that field can claim that market size. And it is also not, it's not about the problem, right? It's numbers without context lack meaning. So if you're going to open with people and be like, yeah, so such and such is an X billion-dollar industry, it has it's not attached to anything for someone to care enough. Also, everyone's got a big number, so why should we necessarily care about yours? You really have to dial in your problem to the value and meaning of one individual person. Because just think of how our brains work, right? Like, you cannot, like, Matt, what's like the largest thing you can picture of, like, when you think of like a group of people, like how big does it get to where you can still create a picture in your head?
Thinking of Arrowhead Stadium with 78,000 in it cheering for the Chiefs.
Yeah, that's literally where I was going to go. It's going to be like a football stadium, right? Like,
as big as it gets.
That's what, maybe, you know, a little bit under 100,000. If you're in Michigan, you might say like the Big House, which is like 120,000. And even at that point, we just kind of, when we picture it, we think of like a sea of people, but not even like individual facial features, right?
Yeah.
You think of like a lot of red jerseys if it's the Chiefs in the stands. So that's as much as our brain can process. But even then, we cannot think through detail at that point. Versus if you pare it down to one fan sitting in one seat at one game, now you have something you can relate to. Now you can picture everything about that person. And if I tell you a problem with that person, you're going to be able to latch onto it a lot easier. And this is actually where, you know, years ago, one of the first companies we ever worked with was about someone in a stadium, like, crazy enough. And it was a company called Fan Food. And the elevator pitch here was, as a diehard sports fan, there's nothing more frustrating than going to your favorite team's game and missing the big play because you were stuck waiting in line for a hot dog and beer.
Yeah.
Right? That right there puts you exactly like in the presence of that person's experience.
You can relate to it.
If you're a sports fan, you probably have had this happen to you, and you'll think about when, like, the game, and everyone, it's crazy when they were doing this pitch, everyone who was into sports in some capacity, or even like, you know, went to live concerts and stuff like that, they had an individual story they would respond with of the play they were at, the game they were at, and the play that they missed.
That makes total sense. So I want to go back to your framework. So you said problem, approach, then was it solution?
Solution and action.
Action. So we talked a lot about the problem and framing the problem. What would you say about the approach? What would be next on your formula here?
So the approach is going to be, think of it as like a catchy one-liner, and it represents your ultimate overarching brand promise to your target audience, to your customer base, your user base. It is not your overarching brand promise to investors. So I just want to clarify that, right? When your target audience in theory could be, well, I'm pitching to investors, so they're my target audience. No, it's the target audience of your actual product. So a way to think of this is, it could be like your company slogan or tagline. So in that case of Fan Food that I was just talking about, we'd had that problem statement, and the approach is Fan Food keeps you in the moment. Right now, that's totally detached from product features. It is living at a 5,000 foot, 10,000 foot overview level and creating that emotional sort of like idea behind what the product's about. We keep you in the moment. And then the solution ends up describing what it is, what it does, and how it helps from like a tactical level. But the approach is going to be that high level statement. When I say you can think about it as like your slogan or your tagline, if you were to put like here's how I would look at it. If you were going to put like major companies through this process, you could take their company slogan and make it their approach statement. So, like, let's look, for example, at WeWork. I mean, I know they've had their issues and everything, but like they rose to pretty big prominence, and like mismanagement is what shot them in the foot. If you walk past any WeWork, you'll see a big decal on the window, and that big decal says "Do what you love." Underneath that, in small letters, it says 24/7 access, flexible lease terms, hundreds of open desks, amenities, tea, coffee, beer, etc. But the lead message is not hundreds of desks. The lead message is "Do what you love." So WeWork's approach statement of this model would be, do what you love with WeWork. Corona is find your beach, right? Corona is not, Mexican lager in a clear bottle where you can drink anywhere. It is find your beach. And then the solution is Mexican lager. Coca-Cola is open happiness. Their approach is not bubbly, refreshing, high fructose corn syrup, refreshment, soft drink. It's open happiness. How are you going to open happiness? Well, we've got this crisp, refreshing drink that every time you open it, you just go.
So that makes total sense. I love that. And I think when I think about full scale, I think about the problem is it's hard to hire software developers. They're expensive. Our approach is we can help you scale affordably, right? You can scale quickly and affordably. Mm-hmm. And the solution is, we have a great team in the Philippines and et cetera, et cetera. So then you get down to solution. Do you want to dive more into the solution part of this?
Yeah, so solution, and this is probably the most self-explanatory part, because this is probably the way that most people listening to this have been talking about their company to this point. This is the, what is it? What is the product? What does it do? How does it help? Why should people care? This is where you're actually describing the thing. Now, depending on the industry you're in, it may be more useful to describe it through the lens of the customer themselves. Sometimes the language gets too complex for that to work. So, what I mean by that is, like, you could phrase things that would be like action oriented from the perspective of the customer. So, like, get your hands on top-notch machinery. So now you're talking about it as if, like, that's the person doing it, right? Versus we produce top-notch machinery. So now you're talking about it from your lens. I say, depending on the industry and the complexity of your solution, it's going to depend on which way you take that kind of a sentence. Because sometimes, especially if it's something newer in a more nascent industry, it's actually more confusing to try and talk about it through that customer first lens. And it's easier to describe it as, like, we do this versus you get this.
Okay.
If you see what I'm saying.
Okay.
So coming back to fan food, right? We had problem. As a diehard sports fan, there's nothing more frustrating than going to your favorite team's game and missing the big play because you were stuck waiting in line for a hot dog and beer. Approach. Fan food keeps you in the moment. Solution. Get your food and drinks delivered directly to your seat through the fan food mobile ordering app, so you never miss a big play again. And that's a consumer-facing, more straightforward one. So you might hear that and be like, but I'm like B2B SaaS. You construct, like, we've done tons of B2B SaaS pitches under this same model. It's the same thing. Like, you want to talk about it through the lens of a customer getting value and an individual customer, right? Not thousands of customers someday, because then that starts to make it. When you talk about it all the time in terms of the thousands of people who would use it and benefit from it, or even think about it through that lens, now you start to make more generalized statements instead of more pointed, targeted, and direct statements that actually mean something to another person.
Less people relate.
Exactly. And that happens all the time. And what you get is people being like, I don't really understand what it does. And the last thing someone's response should be is, I don't get it. Right? They should be saying, wait, tell me more.
The thing I always tell people is your customers have to be able to very easily self-select, right? To very easily know, like, okay, this is the right solution for me. And one of my favorite examples of this is, like, you're looking for a lawyer. You can go to lots of different websites, and there's all kinds of law, right? But if you're like, I have a traffic ticket, like, you want to land on the homepage that says, like, we help you get out of traffic tickets front and clear, and you're like, okay, that's the lawyer for me, right?
Yes.
But that doesn't mean, and potentially you're turning away everybody else, but now every single person that needs help with a traffic ticket, they all say yes. Like, they have all self-selected in. But the problem with most entrepreneurs is they're trying to like service everyone, right? Like, nobody self-selects. Like, nobody understands, like, okay, this is the right solution for me. I can understand, and I understand I'm the right, buyer of this thing, and they will solve my problems. Like, people are always too broad, I feel like is always a challenge.
Yeah. Well, don't be a solution looking for a problem. And if, unfortunately, you find yourself in that situation, flip it. Figure out the problem that this thing best solves.
Yeah.
And even if you're a horizontal product, you can still pull this off, because what's going to unite the, whether it's a sales rep at a SaaS company, or a teacher at a school, or, a CEO or whatever, is the common pain they experience. And that would be an example, like, let's take like a Calendly, for example, right? Those are probably all user groups that use Calendly. But what is the common pain point, whether you are a teacher or a sales executive or whatever, is scheduling meetings sucks, right? It's a lot of back and forth. By the time someone responds to the availability you had, you now are no longer free at that time. And now you got to send another email figuring out new times you're available. And you don't even want to have the meeting by the time you actually get it on the calendar, right? That is something that everyone can relate to. And you can create that sort of broad horizontal pitch. But then if you want, what I would do if I was that company is create unique landing pages for each user group, take that broad pitch, but now dial in the message specific to that group.
Yeah.
Hey, school teacher. And then you create specific scenario, like parent teacher meetings, for example, or hey, CEO, and now you create like board meeting, internal meeting, etc.
So let's talk more about the actions. You talked about problem, approach, solution, action. What do you have for the action step?
Action's going to be like your call to action. It's going to really depend on when and where you're using it. If you are so just think about, like, it can be as simple as like learn more at our website.com. I do like to find like where you can use like a pun whenever possible. There's a company we've worked with. I think their approach statement was about being seen as an expert. So then the action statement is be seen at expertatlas.com. These are the kinds of things that like just make it a little bit more like cheeky and fun. But if you're talking to an investor, in the action step is where you would have one line either about your market size or about traction you have as a company, depending on what's the more attractive number in the moment. So this is where I'm saying, like, it's not market size, doesn't matter at all. It's just take everything you've said about an individual person and then be able to be like, and what's great is this issue represents $400 million worth of problems across the market. And that's how you take the market size and make it have meaning. Because now you think of one person, you've visualized them, and now you can visualize that person kind of duplicating across the market to see, yeah, there's real pain and issue here. And again, or if it's traction, depending on what your traction number might be, what stage you're at, you could go for that number instead. But I would avoid too many numbers, because we're not going to remember any of them if you use more than like two.
And you would have that as part of your action, as like the final.
Yeah.
Okay. What other tips do you have for the action part of this?
I mean, action's pretty quick. It's you're just kind of like wrapping it up and giving them a so what next. So again, if you're going to, K-PASA is great for landing page copy on your website. If you're going to use it there, your action's going to be a button. Click to request demo, click to get more info, download app, whatever it needs to be. If you're using it in a, say, more like casual networking conversation, then your action is probably going to be something like asking the other person a question to like now continue the conversation. Like you might be like, yeah, so like, have you ever like experienced that, or do you know anyone who's experienced that, or questions like that.
Okay. Well, I think this framework is great. And for those of you who are listening, if you're not signed up to the Startup Hustle newsletter, definitely sign up at startuphustlenews.com. I'm sure I'll send out a newsletter article. We'll dive deep into this as well in the newsletter article too. What other tips do you have for entrepreneurs in regards to pitches? And the other thing I'm thinking about is, what does it cost to have somebody like you help a founder? And usually people that are in this mode of trying to raise capital, they don't even have a lot of money, right? So they don't like, hey, I don't have 10 grand to go drop on figuring out how to do this thing.
Yeah.
How do you usually work with your clients? What do you usually charge them for this kind of stuff? Like, give us the pitch on that part of it.
Yeah, definitely. Let me answer the first question first, and I think you said like any other relevant tips or anything like that. Well, we just went through that K-PASA formula. That is the backbone of your pitch deck. And that's how you start to put in front of investors your more customer-focused message. And then you're going to add into the pitch deck, of course, the things that investors care about. But you're structuring the entire narrative around really what matters to a consumer or to your consumer, and then showing that to investors. And there's other things we can talk about as well. But to your other question about my service and how we work at Startup Hype Man, we tier our pricing based on the traction that a company has generated.
Okay.
So we have a complete pitch kit we take people through. One of our taglines is "Don't go to market, become the goat to market." So our pitch kit is called the GTM, or the Goat to Market Pitch Kit, and we call it that because even though it's in the pursuit of a fundraise, it is going to set you up for GTM success because of the way we approach the messaging. And I would say one of the best, pieces of feedback or compliments that we get is the startups that work with us saying, like, coming back and being like, I was prepared for like every kind of conversation that I needed to have, like the structured pitch, the casual conversation, the in between, etc. And we got another piece of feedback where they were like, so this whole kit was like, it was like we came to you with a box of Legos and threw it on the floor. You put together the model into a battleship, but then you handed us the battleship, and because it's Legos, we were able to like see like, oh, if we take these 2 bricks and click them at the bottom, now it becomes a sailboat if we need a sailboat that day. So that's where I say, like, the kind of like the malleability of this process really ends up helping startups in a pretty significant way. I had a moment literally the other week, that company I mentioned briefly, Expert Atlas, where I was in front of their target customer in a conversation just by chance. And they had mentioned something that really hit on, like, that was like what they mentioned was like exactly what we had built their problem statement around, their elevator pitch. And I was like, you know what? I just want you to listen to this for a second. And I verbatim gave the elevator pitch, and that person's response was 1,000% I'm in. If they can deliver on what you just said, 1,000% I'm in. And then they were like, what's the cost? And I told them, and they were like, yeah, that's easy. I pay twice that for a conference that yields no results. I'm like, yes, put me in touch with them. Right? Like, this is the kind of stuff that I want more startups to have success with. Because also, if you're able to like do that stuff and put that message into market, now it's going to influence your traction story. And now you're going to have more likelihood of success with investors, particularly, in a funding climate that's a little bit tighter than the ZERP era. The more you can show we have actual momentum with our customers, we have interest, et cetera, the better your chances are of raising capital. So that's why coming back to like the original point we made in this whole thing, right, is how much the customer message influences the investor message. So in our process, we have this pitch kit where we build your elevator pitch. We figure out the full narrative of your pitch deck. We design the slides. Very unique, that I don't know if anyone else offers or is even able to do. When we build the story of a pitch deck, we build it out in like an outline document first. We meet with the customer. We show it to them. We review it together, make sure it looks good from all angles. And then we press the record button, and myself or whoever's their lead point of contact, their pitch artist, as we call it, we will do a live freestyle pitch of their company back to them. So we press record, and we become them, and they become their own audience, and we pitch their own company back to them. And I call it the live freestyle pitch because, doing this enough times, it really is at a point where I can look at an outline I've just made and literally like riff their entire pitch. So we do that. We create a nice document called a brand manifesto, which is designed to highlight founder market fit, which is what they put in front of investors. And then we also give them an audio recording of their elevator pitch, the K-PASA, which is something that I act as the voice of their brand for that asset. So I get on the microphone and kind of deliver that pitch as if it's like a podcast advertisement. And then we zip it up into an audio file. And now they have that as a asset to distribute amongst investors, which is it's different and it's way more attractive to be like, click here to listen to our 60-second pitch. Let me know if you want to learn more. So that's our typical process. There's some variance sometimes based on the type of company, but coming back to the pricing of it, we tier the pricing based on the stage of company and the traction they've generated. So the metric we look at is the total sum of any previous capital raised plus revenue generated.
Okay.
So it's going to tier downwards based on the lower that number is. So tier 1 is going to be if that sum is over $1 million. And depending on like specific nuance to the company itself, this is going to be somewhere between like 12 and 15K.
Okay.
And that's really what the value of the whole thing is, right? But what we're saying is like, we're going to graduate that down based on your affordability level. And the tier 1s who can afford the true value of it, they're going to pay it and help offset the cost for tier 2 and tier 3. So tier 2 is if your traction sum is between 500K and $1 million, and this will end up right around like between 7 and 9K. And then if you're tier 3, it's your traction is under 500K, and this is going to be starting at about 5K.
Okay.
Maybe 5,500. But again, based on like specific type of company, there's a little bit of variance. We have to make sure what the exact pricing is, but that's, roughly you could say like it's about 5K, it's about 7, 8K, it's about 12K.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and for a lot of companies that are first starting out, I imagine you actually can help provide them their first blueprint for kind of all their marketing from this process, right? Like they're struggling with all of their marketing and their messaging. You go through this process with you and they'll feel much more confident about not only their pitch to customers, their pitch to investors, but also all the messaging and going back to their website and changing the marketing content on their website. Like I'm sure you help guide, what you do is much more valuable than just an investor pitch. It's like helping drive a lot of the messaging, I would imagine.
Yeah. And that's why I believe in this so much. And again, why I think I'm going to keep harping on this. Like, don't just think about your pitch as a thing you do for investors. You're wasting time if you only think about it through that lens. This is about figuring out your go-to-market message, your customer message, your user message, your marketing, your sales message, etc. Use that as your lead. And with that in place, now you have a stronger investor pitch.
Very good, man. Well, I really appreciate having you on the show today. Again, this was Rajiv Nathan, the Startup Hype Man, just startuphypeman.com. Look forward to the newsletter article that we'll publish about this too. We'll try and cover some more in depth about his K-PASA formula. So that'll be at startuphustlenews.com if you're not subscribed. Rajiv, thanks so much for doing this today, and I'm all hyped up. So thank you for doing this.
Right on. Appreciate you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you, sir.